Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to continue our look at the English colonial system in North America. So let's get started. The drive and goal and appeal of coming to the Americas was definitely there. There was lots of ways to get here if you really wanted to, but despite this, the population in the Americas continued to be problematic. It was never very high early on, and dying here was pretty likely. That combined meant that the old systems needed to change. And one way that a new incentive came about was the headright system. And this came about in 1618. And the idea of the headright system said that if I can get one person to sign up to come to the Americas, that person and I each receive 50 acres of land, which is plenty for a family farm. And that's a great incentive for somebody who, over an indentured servant system. Yeah, you're probably going to be an indentured servant, but some indentured servants, at the end of their 7-year contract, they walked away with the shirt on their back and very little else. This was a guarantee 50 acres of land for that person. And if you had a family, great, you're now set. If I am rich and I bring over, let's say, 10 folks, then each of those folks gets 50 acres, but I collectively just earned 500 acres. And if I have an area of land that large, then probably I would want to go and make sure it's being run effectively. This system both brings in people to tend to the land, stay in the Americas, and rich, large landowning folks who want a new chapter in their lives to begin. This system definitely benefited the wealthy, but if you were wanting to start off, this was a major incentive. The very next year, kind of because there are so many new people coming and so many new wealthy folks, and kind of the premise that this society needed more than just growing of landed goods, the House of Burgesses will be created. Society needs rules, rules that would be created by a government system. The House of Burgesses was a representative government. This was the first representative government in colonial America and the world, really. If you wanted to be a member of this, you had to be a landowner. You had to have a substantial tract of land, more than the 50 acres for the headright system. And this would make you a prominent member in this governing body. Now, if you had acreage back in England, you could be a member of Parliament. You could apply to be, you could run for Parliament. You could vote for your local magistrate, but you're needing to talk like 300 acres just for that. In the Americas, you need a third of that to get started. So the opportunities are a lot quicker, the kind of regulations are a lot easier, and well, it was definitely a good thing to be able to say you want to be involved in your state. In 1622, there is a Native American uprising in Virginia. Pocahontas' brother leads an attack on the settlers in Virginia, prominently entering settlements without weapons, and then at the agreed upon time, natives just grabbed weapons that were there, kitchen knives, spears, for anything, guns, and attacked. And by the time this uprising was done, a quarter of the population of Virginia was now dead. And the survivors wanted to, quote, rid the savages from the free range of the country. And when it was done, Native Americans in Virginia were forced west beyond the settlers' range, beyond the settlements completely. And this is a trend that's going to continue. As we have previously said, the British were more interested in displacing Native Americans than living with and intermarrying them. That process really begins in earnest in 1622 at the end of this uprising. Tobacco was major money in the early 17th century and would continue to be major money throughout this time for about the next 100 years. If you had a large plantation, then you are probably growing tobacco on it. And this is a time where those large bushels that you see down there, the ones that are stacked as tall as that man's knee, could fetch a couple of $1,000s easily. It's a lot of money. The problem is, number one, tobacco exhausts the land. It needs a lot of nutrients from the soil, a lot of water, a lot of heat, and once the soil is tapped out, you have to move your operation on. You have to buy new land, you have to go and plant new seeds somewhere else. And this usually expansion model meant you were going to come into conflict with Native Americans sooner rather than later. If you owned a large tract of land, like we're talking hundreds of acres, and you are producing a fortune in tobacco, then that means that a smaller and smaller number of folk are going to control the local political system. And by this point in the Chesapeake region, in Virginia, more people are going to be indentured servants than just coming to get started. This is going to create a social division as well. To get some numbers behind how quickly tobacco was growing, in 1624, about 200,000 pounds of tobacco are being grown in the Chesapeake every year. 3 decades later, it's up to 15 million pounds. And another 30 years after that, it'll double again. This is growing so quickly that an increasing reliance on labor happens. We're going to see that indentured servitude will not be able to keep up with this demand. Couple that with the fact that, indentured servants after 7 years, they are, free to go and do their own thing. But slavery, once you have it and you buy that person, you own that person for the rest of their life. It's going to be an easier justification for folks. Unfortunately, this impact of being very, very wealthy and on one side versus your 50-acre family farm means you have a big disparity between your wealthy and your not wealthy. There's no middle class, and you have this creation of a landed gentry aristocracy. By the middle of the 17th century, only about 100 families will control the wealth and the power of the Virginia colony itself. During this time, men are going to be coming to the Americas much more than women. There is a 5-to-1 ratio of men over women. Most women who are going to come here will come as indentured servants also. That or criminals. Yes, the goal is to come with your family, but that might mean that the entire family enters into indentured servant contracts. If you're a single woman who signs an indentured contract and comes to the Americas, you have a couple of things that are going to affect you also. Most principally, it was illegal to get married while under an indentured contract. And that 7 years would push back your ability to get married and start a family. So, in essence, we see that American families during the early 17th century are going to start happening later in life and therefore having fewer children. Your life expectancy during this time also is not super great. It's about 10 years shorter than it would be back in England. And mind you, in England, it's not like you're living into your 90s. The life expectancy was your 40s, and that's pretty common. One thing that really does start to change is what women receive when their husbands die, and this is dower rights. The idea that when a husband died, no matter what, the wife would receive a third of his property. It doesn't matter if you have one child and it is split down the middle, and the widow gets a third of it and the son gets 2/3. It doesn't matter if you have 8 children, the wife is guaranteed a third and the other 2/3 are divided among the rest of the family. This was unprecedented back in Europe, where it was kind of up to the eldest son to decide who gets what, and the idea of primogeniture. Maryland becomes a colony in 1632. It becomes a proprietary colony under this guy, Cecilius Calvert. Now, Calvert wants to create a colony that will be a safe haven for Catholics. You see, in England, after the Protestant Reformation, we see that there is a big persecution against Catholics. When Mary Tudor comes to the power, she makes England all Catholic again, and she goes on to kill 400 people by fire, Protestants, and earns a lot of enemies and the nickname Bloody Mary for that. When she dies and England goes back to being Protestant, Catholic British folks found they were heavily persecuted against. So Calvert hoped that Maryland would be a place that they could be safe. They could start and live and not have to worry about any kind of persecution. And initially, Catholics will outnumber the Protestants who are going to start coming here. In 1649, an act is passed by Calvert, the Act of Toleration, that says all Christians will receive equal protection under the laws. Now that he had established that Maryland was a place that had a large Catholic population, he wanted it to be safe for anyone who wanted to come here and further protect his people. But Maryland had some other problems going on with it, specifically disease. Malaria was very common. About 40% of your servants die just from this, and they won't even finish out the 7-year contract, and that's just from malaria. Water gets polluted and people get sick and they have dysentery and then die from that. Life expectancy was about 45, so it's on par with what it would be back in England, but that's not necessarily great. Remarrying is very common. Most kids, before they reach adolescence, will lose at least one parent. And unfortunately, if you are an indentured servant and you finish your time, getting land wasn't as easy as other places. Maryland had created these survey fees, these registration fees, so that you had to spend much more to get land. And as it was a proprietary colony, that meant that Calvert would receive that money directly. And there were some definite problems with how that was run. Puritans were a reaction group to the Protestant Reformation. When England became Protestant, they adopted a branch of Protestantism called Anglicanism, the Church of England. Largely speaking, Anglicanism didn't stray super far away from Catholicism. And the Puritans believed that because the Anglican Church still maintained a lot of Catholic traditions and rituals, it needed to be purified. They believed in the idea of predestination, the idea that before you are born, it has already been decided if you are going to heaven or hell. And there isn't a thing you can do while you're alive in order to change that. So you better live your best life possible, hoping for that. The ideal society was what they wanted to create. Infamously, John Winthrop, who's depicted here, talked of creating a city upon a hill, the society for which all others would look up to and aspire to be. They did not believe in religious freedoms. They didn't believe in speaking out. There's an old Japanese phrase, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. This was definitely something the Puritans took to heart. When Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, and we'll talk about them a little later, both talked about the system or criticized the system or pointed out flaws in it, they were banished. For Puritans, liberty meant you can establish your church, you can govern your state, and your belief will not be challenged. You can do these things without fear of persecution or obstruction. The first Puritans who start to come to the Americas, the real Pilgrims, when you think Puritan and Pilgrim, this is who we're talking about. They first leave England and they go to the Netherlands in 1608. But they feel that they are still not being allowed to live the life they want to live. So they leave Europe entirely in 1620 on the Mayflower and come here. The trip across the Atlantic was pretty rough. There was more and more who would not survive on this one. Bad storm would facilitate part of it. The other part was just supplies running out. They were blown off course by a couple of 100 miles to the north. Before they landed, though, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, the idea of what laws were going to be like in this new civilization, in this new society, and the idea of the elected representative. It was open to all, and that was big. Initially, you could vote just so long as you were a good citizen in the Puritan society. That would change over time, and there'd be some established barriers to voting, but initially that was it. Now, when you look at the first Plymouth landing site, it looks much more open than what we had previously seen. The walls are not as tall, the fortifications are not as established, and there's that infamous rock at Plymouth. Even marked in, hey look, this is when we landed. Neat. Some of our big differences between Plymouth and Jamestown early on, first off, is families. For Plymouth, it was a family thing. You and your family were escaping religious persecution. Jamestown, it was much more you, the individual, are seeking freedom and looking for, in some cases, money or land or a legacy, which also steps into purpose. A unified team and teamwork was really instrumental and very important in Plymouth. They arrived hundreds of miles further north. It got much colder, and they arrived much closer to winter. So planting the food and harvesting anything, that didn't really happen as much as it could have. And very, very quickly, the Plymouth colony comes into a lot of problems. Those problems do start to disappear, or at least change for a while, with the Native Americans in the region. Samoset was a Native American who had been kidnapped by the Spanish, taken to Europe. He learns English, he escapes, he gets back to the Americas, reunites with his tribe, and is one of the first Native Americans to see the Plymouth colony, to see the Puritans here. And he and a group of other Native Americans actually approached the colony one cold morning after the colonists had recently finished burying a lot of dead people. And the Puritans inside Plymouth are thinking, oh, this is it. This is where we're about to die. This is the attack. This is it. And Samoset greets them in their native language. He learned to speak English. So for these Puritans, this was a moment of, wait, you got to be kidding me. The idea that we are on the other side of the world and this Native American is speaking to us in English, they thought it was providence. They thought that he had been sent by their God. They are introduced to Samoset's chief, Squanto, and the Native Americans and the Puritans enter into a series of regional agreements, alliances. The natives teach the Puritans how to plant. There is some good trading that goes on. The idea of planting fish to fertilize the soil so your crops can grow in the sandy soil is one of the things that helped the Puritans survive. Now, this wasn't just a one-sided, okay, here's all this stuff, then the Native Americans like, goodbye. There was an agreement that the Puritans would help Squanto's tribe, the Wampanoag, against another Native American group. And at the end of their first year, they landed in 1620. At the end of the first year, the survival, the end of the first harvest is that Thanksgiving, the feast of thanks, of survival, of gratitude, of we are entering the next long night, and hooray, we made it. The idea of Plymouth as a religious place worked, but it was not the kind of thing that could work forever. It sat right at the edge of Cape Cod, and people wanted to come here and also invest, trade, conquer fur animals. And over time, we see that the colony adapts to these things. One of the big things that happens is initially the Puritans at Plymouth say all land is equal for all members, and then that ends and privatized land comes into effect, the idea that, yes, this is my land. Some would call this early communism. Some would call this working together. I'll leave that up to the philosophers. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony arrives, there is a demand to grow more food, to supply more people. Within 10 years of the landing, Plymouth's population was still tiny. It was only 300 people. There was the question of, what are we going to do? Are we going to expand and make this larger? Are we going to change who we are? We came here for religious reasons. Now there's other people living here. How do we interact with them? Plymouth was not really super influential in the Massachusetts Bay. There were fewer and fewer Puritans who were running to join Plymouth. And for people who are living here, the expectation is also, we need this community to grow. So for young people, you needed to get married and start having kids earlier than you would back in England. in some cases on average by a couple of years. And it was expected you were going to average more kids than you would back in England too, which would probably lead, in the 17th century on the frontier, to dying in childbirth much more likely. So these problems were definitely present and would only be exacerbated with the role of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But that's a story we'll continue for another time. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.